The year is 549 before Christ. Cyrus the Great, the legendary founder of the Persian Empire, has conquered kingdom after kingdom. His armies seem unstoppable, his reputation unmatched. But then, he meets his end not at the hands of another emperor, nor a mighty coalition of kings, but at the hands of a woman, Queen Tomyris of the Massagetæ. She defeated him in battle, secured her people's freedom, and carved her name into history. But how many of us were ever taught her story? How often do we hear about the women who shaped the course of nations and empires? We know the names of Alexander, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon. Yet the names of queens, empresses, and regents who fought, ruled, and built civilizations are too often erased, reduced, or ignored. Their lives were full of ambition, brilliance, and courage, yet their stories are scattered in fragments, overshadowed by the men who wrote history. And that raises the question, what happens when we bring their voices back into the light? What happens when we tell the stories of women who stood against the most powerful men of their time, who ruled in their own right, and who defied expectations? These women are not footnotes. They are central characters in the human story. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we will journey into the lives of extraordinary women rulers who refused to remain silent in the margins of history. From warrior queens who defeated empires to pharaohs who defied tradition, to empresses who challenged Rome itself, their echoes still matter today. Stay with us as we uncover their forgotten legacies and ask why history tried so hard to erase them. When people think about Alexander the Great, they recall a young man who conquered vast lands before the age of 33, spreading Hellenistic culture from Greece to Egypt and into India. His image as a bold general and king is etched deeply into our imagination. But what about the women? While we know Alexander's name, his mother Olympias is rarely spoken of, despite her significant role in shaping him and influencing the politics of Macedonia. She was not only a queen but also a strategist, a power broker, and a woman who secured her family's survival in a brutal world of shifting allegiances. Her story, like that of countless other women who held thrones, wielded armies, and ruled empires, has been pushed to the margins of history. For centuries, the telling of history has been dominated by male voices and perspectives. Traditional chronicles, often written by male scribes, court historians, or religious scholars, centered on kings, generals, popes, and emperors. Women who influenced politics, culture, and warfare were often ignored, dismissed, or portrayed as mere companions or seductresses. This selective lens actively erased the presence of queens, empresses, and regents who commanded nations with the same authority and intelligence as their male counterparts. We are left with an incomplete story, a half-history where the contributions of women are silenced not because they were absent, but because they were deliberately overlooked. Take Cleopatra of Egypt, who is remembered today largely as a temptress who ensnared Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. That popular image, shaped by Roman propaganda and reinforced through later literature and film, reduces her to her relationships with men. Yet Cleopatra was a skilled linguist, a diplomat, and an administrator who kept Egypt independent for 2 decades against the might of Rome. Her naval strategies and economic policies stabilized her kingdom during times of crisis. Still, her legacy has been flattened to that of a lover, rather than a ruler equal to the men she negotiated and fought against. The case of Cleopatra is not isolated. Throughout history, women who held power have been systematically reframed. Wu Zetian, the only woman to rule China in her own right, was vilified by later historians as ruthless and immoral. Yet under her reign, the Tang dynasty expanded its influence, reformed its bureaucracy, and promoted meritocracy by opening government posts to talent outside the aristocracy. Rather than being remembered for these achievements, she has been depicted as a usurper who disrupted the natural order. The narrative, written by men loyal to patriarchal ideals, painted her as a cautionary tale rather than as a model of capable leadership. Even in medieval Europe, women rose to positions of extraordinary power, but their reputations were often reduced to caricatures. Eleanor of Aquitaine was not only the Queen of France and later of England, but also a military leader who joined the Second Crusade, a patron of the arts, and the mother of 2 kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. Despite her immense political influence, chronicles often painted her as meddling, overly ambitious, or scandalous. The framing reveals more about the discomfort of male chroniclers with female authority than about Eleanor herself. The silencing of women in history was not accidental but deliberate. In societies where patriarchal structures defined legitimacy, recording the deeds of female rulers threatened the established order. Chroniclers often sought to preserve the image of kingship as exclusively male, erasing women from official narratives or presenting them only in relation to men. Over time, this repeated omission created an illusion that women had little to no role in governance, warfare, or cultural development. The truth, however, is far richer and far more complex. Consider Hatshepsut of ancient Egypt, who declared herself pharaoh and ruled successfully for over 20 years. She established trade networks, launched ambitious building projects, and maintained peace and prosperity. Yet after her death, her successor Thutmose attempted to erase her legacy, chiseling her name and images from monuments. For centuries, her existence was nearly forgotten until archaeologists pieced together her story from fragments. The attempt to literally carve her out of history mirrors the metaphorical erasure that so many women faced across different cultures and eras. In India, Razia Sultan ruled Delhi in the 13th century as the only woman ever to sit on the throne of the Sultanate. Despite her administrative competence and military leadership, chroniclers often emphasized her appearance or her defiance of gender norms rather than her governance. She dressed in male attire during public audiences, not out of vanity, but as a deliberate choice to assert her authority in a male-dominated court. Her reign ended violently, but the narratives about her focused less on her policies and more on the supposed scandal of her daring to rule as a woman. Similarly, in the African kingdom of Ndongo and Matamba, Queen Nzinga of Angola resisted Portuguese colonization in the 17th century with extraordinary skill. She formed alliances, conducted diplomacy, and led military campaigns for decades. When negotiating with Portuguese officials, she famously refused to sit on the ground as a subordinate. Instead, she had one of her attendants kneel so she could sit on their back, symbolizing her refusal to accept humiliation. Her story is one of resilience and ingenuity, yet it has often been overshadowed in global narratives of resistance to colonialism, which prefer to highlight male leaders. In the Americas, before European conquest, women also held power in various societies. Among the Mayans and Aztecs, noble women could hold political influence, and in some cases acted as regents for their sons. After colonization, women like Anaquona, the Taino chief of Hispaniola, resisted Spanish domination. She was renowned for her diplomacy and leadership, but she was executed by the Spanish to break the spirit of her people. Her courage, though remembered in local traditions, rarely finds its place in mainstream history books. These examples are only fragments of a much larger picture. Across continents and centuries, women governed, commanded armies, managed economies, and shaped cultures. Yet, the structure of historical storytelling has continually marginalized them. The male-centric bias has left us with the impression that women in power were rare exceptions, anomalies in an otherwise uninterrupted line of male dominance. The truth is that they were present in greater numbers and with greater influence than we are often led to believe. The absence lies not in history itself, but in the telling of it. The erasure of women's political and cultural contributions has consequences beyond academic interest. It shapes how societies understand leadership, authority, and gender. When young people learn about history that features only men as leaders, they internalize the idea that leadership is naturally masculine. This perception perpetuates inequalities in politics and society today. By recovering and amplifying the stories of forgotten queens, empresses, and regents, we challenge the myth that power belongs only to men. We restore balance to our collective memory and recognize that women have always been central to human history. The question is not whether these women existed, but why their stories are not more widely known. Part of the reason lies in who had the power to write history. Literacy, institutions, and archives were often controlled by men who decided which stories were worthy of preservation. Women's voices and achievements were often confined to oral traditions, folk tales, or marginal notes, which scholars later dismissed as less reliable. In many cases, the surviving sources were actively hostile to women in power, portraying them through the lens of suspicion or scandal. When modern historians rely uncritically on these sources, they risk reinforcing old biases instead of questioning them. Another reason lies in cultural myths that have survived into modern times. The archetype of the dangerous woman in power, the schemer, the temptress, the witch, has been repeated for centuries. Figures like Catherine de' Medici in France were depicted as poisoners and manipulators, even though her political maneuvering during the wars of religion was a pragmatic effort to hold a divided country together. By framing women rulers as dangerous or unnatural, chroniclers reinforced the notion that female authority was inherently illegitimate. Yet, when we look closer, we see that women leaders were judged by a double standard. Qualities admired in male rulers, ambition, decisiveness, cunning, were condemned in women as arrogance or deceit. Male rulers could be ruthless and still celebrated as strong leaders, while women were labeled monstrous for the same behavior. This uneven judgment reveals how much the erasure of women was not about their lack of power, but about society's refusal to acknowledge their legitimacy. Even in modern times, the recovery of women's histories faces challenges. Academic historians have made strides in the past century, uncovering records, inscriptions, and artifacts that shed light on forgotten queens and rulers. But popular culture often lags behind, clinging to simplified versions of history that center men. School textbooks still devote far more space to male generals and kings than to female rulers. When women are mentioned, it is often in sidebars or as footnotes, rather than as central figures. The persistence of this imbalance shows how deeply entrenched the silence is. But the silence is being broken. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in figures like Hatshepsut, Wu Zetian, Nzinga, and Razia Sultan. Historical novels, documentaries, and scholarly works are bringing their stories to wider audiences. This shift reflects a growing recognition that history is not complete without them. It is not enough to sprinkle a few women into the margins of the story. Their presence demands a rethinking of how we structure history itself. They were not side characters, but rulers whose decisions shaped the course of nations. To understand why these women were forgotten, we must confront uncomfortable truths about how history has been written. It was never a neutral recording of facts. It was a narrative shaped by power, by those who had the authority to decide whose voices counted. In this sense, the silence around women rulers is not simply a matter of oversight, but a reflection of broader systems of exclusion. To recover their stories is not merely to honor their memory, but to challenge the very way we think about the past. Imagine if our understanding of leadership were built on both men and women equally. Imagine if children grew up learning not only about Alexander and Caesar, but also about Olympias, Cleopatra, and Wu Zetian. Imagine if they studied not only Charlemagne and Richard, but also Eleanor of Aquitaine and Isabella of Castile. The result would be a richer, more truthful understanding of history. It would also offer a broader vision of what leadership can look like, free from the limitations of gendered stereotypes. The silence around these women has lasted too long. But silence is not the same as absence. They were there, ruling, commanding, and shaping their worlds. Their stories remain, waiting to be told, not as exceptions but as part of the fabric of history itself. To bring them into the light is not to rewrite history, but to restore it, to give it the fullness it has always deserved. And when we do, we find that the past is not only about men, but about women whose voices still echo, even after centuries of being silenced. When we speak of the forgotten queens and rulers whose names were deliberately buried under the weight of male-dominated storytelling, there is perhaps no better example of sheer militaristic strength and defiance than Tomyris, the warrior queen of the Massagetæ. If Cleopatra has been dismissed as a lover, and Wu Zetian condemned as a usurper, Tomyris represents something even more threatening to the male chroniclers of her time. A woman who not only led her people into war, but defeated one of the most celebrated conquerors in history, Cyrus the Great of Persia. Her story is not merely one of survival or resistance, but of absolute victory. Unlike so many women leaders who have been framed through scandal or romance, Tomyris is remembered through the clash of swords, the roar of battle, and the shocking outcome of a confrontation that shook the ancient world. The Massagetæ were a nomadic confederation of tribes who roamed the vast steppes of Central Asia, east of the Caspian Sea. They were not sedentary empire builders like the Persians, but fierce warriors who lived off horseback warfare, hunting, and raiding. They prized independence above all, and like many nomadic groups, they were seen by settled empires as both threatening and uncivilized. Yet it was among them that Tomyris rose to power, ruling after the death of her husband, and establishing herself as both a political and military leader. In this, she reflected a recurring theme among societies where survival depended on war. Women could, and did, take command when the need arose. Her story intersects with that of Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus had already conquered the Median Empire, subdued the Lydians under King Croesus and claimed Babylon, where he was hailed as a liberator. His empire stretched across vast lands, from the Aegean coast to the heartlands of Mesopotamia. He was ambitious and relentless, and the Masate, standing to the northeast, represented both a challenge and an opportunity. To Cyrus, conquering them would secure his empire's frontier and extend his influence deeper into the steppe. But to Tomyris, Cyrus represented the encroaching threat of imperial domination that sought to strip her people of their freedom. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian who recorded the encounter, Cyrus initially tried to subdue the Masate through diplomacy. He proposed marriage to Tomyris, a union that would have brought her under his authority. She rejected this transparent ploy, recognizing it not as an offer of alliance, but as a disguised attempt at conquest. Her refusal already signaled her defiance. She would not surrender her sovereignty through either seduction or politics. If Cyrus wanted the land of the Masate, he would have to take it by force. And so the clash was set. Cyrus advanced with his army, bringing with him the strength of the Persian military machine. Yet he underestimated Tomyris, both as a leader and as a strategist. Herodotus tells us that Cyrus attempted to lure the Masate into weakness by leaving behind a camp filled with wine and rich foods. The Masate, unfamiliar with wine, indulged heavily and were overcome. The Persians then ambushed them, killing many and capturing others, including Spargapises, the son of Tomyris. For Cyrus, it seemed like a brilliant maneuver. For Tomyris, it was a devastating blow, but not the end. When Spargapises realized the trap he had fallen into, he begged Cyrus to release him. Once free, he took his own life, unwilling to live with the shame of his capture. The grief this caused Tomyris was immense, but rather than submit to despair, she transformed her loss into resolve. She sent a message to Cyrus, denouncing him for his deceit and vowing revenge. In her words, she accused him of bloodlust and declared that she would quench his thirst for blood with his own. This was not the voice of a supplicant queen, but of a warrior who commanded both rage and power. The final confrontation that followed was decisive. Tomyris gathered the full strength of her forces and engaged Cyrus in open battle. The Masate, fierce mounted warriors skilled with bows and axes, clashed with the disciplined ranks of the Persian army. The fighting was brutal and relentless, but the tide turned against Cyrus. The Persians were overwhelmed, and Cyrus himself fell in the chaos of the battlefield. Herodotus describes this as one of the bloodiest battles the ancient world had ever seen. What followed became legend. Tomyris, true to her vow, sought out Cyrus's body. In a gesture both symbolic and shocking, she ordered his corpse decapitated, and his head placed in a wineskin filled with blood. In doing so, she declared that she had given him his fill of the substance he so craved. This act was more than vengeance. It was a statement that the mighty Persian conqueror, who had subdued kings and cities across Asia, was no match for a woman who ruled a nomadic people often dismissed as barbaric. The image of Tomyris holding Cyrus's fate in her hands has endured precisely because it defies the expectations of gender and power that structured ancient history. The consequences of her victory were profound. The death of Cyrus the Great did not destroy the Persian Empire, but it halted its immediate expansion into Central Asia. Tomyris and her people remained independent, preserving their way of life against the encroaching tide of empire. In this sense, her triumph was not only personal but civilizational. It safeguarded the sovereignty of her people in the face of one of the most powerful imperial projects the world had yet seen. Where other societies were absorbed into the Persian fold, the Masate remained free because their queen refused to yield. And yet, despite the magnitude of her victory, Tomyris is scarcely remembered in the mainstream telling of history. Cyrus is celebrated as a great ruler, a lawgiver, and a liberator, praised in both Persian and biblical traditions. Tomyris, meanwhile, is mentioned mostly as a footnote, a curious story about an obscure queen who killed a king. The imbalance is telling. Once again, the achievements of a woman who defied empire and altered its course were diminished in order to maintain the illusion of male supremacy in history's grand narrative. Her story raises important questions about how we define greatness. If greatness is measured by military success, then Tomyris belongs alongside Alexander, Hannibal, and Caesar. If greatness is measured by defiance of empire, then she stands with Leonidas at Thermopylae or Arminius in the Teutoburg forest. Yet her gender ensured that her story would be cast differently. To ancient chroniclers, it was easier to frame her as a curiosity, a savage queen who achieved victory through rage, than to acknowledge her as a strategist and commander who matched and defeated one of history's most celebrated kings. But when we strip away the layers of bias, the truth becomes clear. Tomyris was not a footnote, but a force. She represents a different model of female power, one not built on dynastic marriages, regencies, or court intrigue, but on direct command of armies and the willingness to meet empire head-on. Her story complicates the myth that women have no place in the history of warfare. She was not simply present, she was decisive. The trajectory of Persian expansion was forever shaped by her refusal to submit, and in that moment, the fate of nations turned on the leadership of a woman. Seen in this light, Tomyris belongs within the larger tapestry of forgotten queens and rulers who were erased from history. Like Hatshepsut, her image was nearly destroyed. Like Cleopatra, she was reduced to a story about emotions rather than policies. Like Nzinga, her martial brilliance was downplayed in favor of exoticizing her defiance. And yet, despite these attempts to silence her, her legend endured, carried through the centuries as a reminder that women have always been central to history's most defining struggles. The silence around her name is not accidental. It reflects the unease of a patriarchal tradition that could not accept the possibility that a woman might defeat one of history's greatest kings. But the silence cannot erase the fact that she did. Her victory, shocking in its time, remains one of the clearest examples of how the omission of women's stories distorts our understanding of the past. To remember Tomyris is to remember that history was never the domain of men alone. It was, and always has been, shaped by women who fought, ruled, and conquered. In reclaiming her story, we do more than honor a queen long forgotten. We begin to correct the imbalance that has shaped how we understand power itself. Tomyris was not an exception, nor a curiosity. She was a ruler who defended her people, altered the course of empire, and proved that women could lead armies to victory as surely as any man. Her story is a challenge to the silence that has long denied women their place in history. It reminds us that when we listen carefully, we can still hear the voices of those who refused to be erased, echoing across the centuries with the sound of defiance and triumph. In thinking about Tomyris and the stunning way she altered the course of empire by defeating Cyrus, it becomes impossible not to draw a line forward to another woman whose story was equally extraordinary, though it played out in a different land and in a different form of power. Where Tomyris asserted her strength on the battlefield, Hatshepsut of Egypt asserted hers in the throne room, the temple, and the marketplace. If Tomyris showed that women could be warriors and conquerors, Hatshepsut showed that women could be pharaohs, the very embodiment of divine kingship. She was not content to serve as a caretaker ruler on behalf of a young heir, nor to quietly guide policy from behind the scenes. She declared herself pharaoh, taking on the full regalia, titles, and divine authority of the office. In doing so, she forced her contemporaries to accept what had been unthinkable, that a woman could rule Egypt not as a regent but as its sovereign. Hatshepsut lived in the 15th century before the Common Era, during the 18th dynasty of Egypt, a period that produced some of its most famous pharaohs. She was the daughter of Thutmose I, a powerful king who expanded Egypt's influence deep into Nubia and the Near East. She married her half-brother, Thutmose II, a common practice among Egyptian royalty to preserve the divine bloodline. When Thutmose II died, the throne passed to his infant son by a lesser wife, Thutmose III. By custom, Hatshepsut was to serve as regent, ruling until the boy came of age. But what unfolded was far more remarkable. Instead of simply holding power temporarily, Hatshepsut gradually consolidated authority and declared herself pharaoh in her own right, adopting the full titles and even the masculine imagery traditionally reserved for kings. Her decision was not an act of vanity, but a calculated move to preserve stability and assert legitimacy. Egypt was a deeply religious society where kingship was tied to the divine order, the concept of Ma'at, which represented balance, justice, and cosmic harmony. The pharaoh was not just a ruler, but the living intermediary between the gods and the people. For a woman to step into this role required an extraordinary reimagining of tradition. Hatshepsut achieved this through careful religious and political maneuvering. She proclaimed that the god Ammonius himself had chosen her as his earthly representative. In inscriptions, she presented herself as the beloved of the gods, chosen to rule not by accident but by divine will. This framing gave her reign an aura of inevitability, positioning her not as an interloper but as the rightful guardian of Egypt. Hatshepsut's reign proved not only legitimate, but immensely prosperous. Rather than focus on endless military campaigns, she invested in stability, trade, and monumental building. One of her most celebrated achievements was the revival of trade networks that had languished in previous years. She organized a grand expedition to the land of Punt, a region likely located along the Red Sea coast or in the Horn of Africa. This expedition returned with treasures that astonished her people: myrrh, frankincense, exotic woods, ivory, and even live trees that were planted in temple courtyards. The success of this journey was immortalized on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, where intricate reliefs depict ships laden with goods and the lush bounty of Punt. These scenes were not merely records of trade. They were propaganda of prosperity, reinforcing the idea that under Hatshepsut, Egypt thrived as never before. Her building projects were equally ambitious. She commissioned temples, shrines, and statues throughout the land, leaving a visible mark on Egypt's landscape. Most famously, she constructed her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a masterpiece of architecture that still inspires awe. Built into the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile, its terraced design, elegant colonnades, and harmonious proportions made it one of the greatest achievements of ancient Egyptian architecture. The temple was dedicated not only to Hatshepsut herself, but also to Ammonius, reinforcing the sacred legitimacy of her reign. Within its walls, reliefs depict her divine birth, her coronation, and her triumphs, creating a carefully curated narrative of her authority. By embedding her story in stone, she sought to ensure her place in eternity. Yet Hatshepsut was not a passive ruler content with trade and construction alone. She maintained Egypt's military strength, launching campaigns into Nubia and securing its wealth of gold and resources. She also fortified Egypt's borders and reasserted its influence over neighboring lands. Her reign lasted over 2 decades, and during that time Egypt enjoyed stability, prosperity, and cultural flourishing. Far from being a temporary caretaker, she proved herself one of the most capable pharaohs in Egyptian history. And yet, her story did not end with celebration. After her death, an extraordinary attempt was made to erase her from history. In later years, inscriptions bearing her name were defaced, statues were smashed or recarved, and her image was chiseled away from monuments. For centuries, her very existence was almost forgotten. Scholars debated whether this erasure was ordered by Thutmose III, who finally ruled alone after her death, or by later pharaohs who sought to reinforce the idea that women could not and should not rule as kings. Whatever the precise motivation, the effect was clear. There was a deliberate attempt to remove her from memory, to deny her achievements, and to restore the illusion of uninterrupted male kingship. This systematic erasure underscores the discomfort her reign created. The very fact that a woman had declared herself pharaoh, ruled successfully, and left an enduring legacy of prosperity was deeply threatening to the patriarchal order of both her contemporaries and later generations. Her story was not erased because she failed, but because she succeeded. Her accomplishments proved that women could occupy the highest position of power, and that truth was so disruptive it had to be buried. It was only in modern times, through archaeology and scholarship, that her story resurfaced. The discovery of her temple, inscriptions, and surviving statues revealed the scale of her reign and the magnitude of her achievements. What had once been hidden emerged as one of the most striking examples of female leadership in history. Hatshepsut was not a footnote or a curiosity. She was a pharaoh, equal in authority to the greatest kings of Egypt, and she reigned with distinction. When viewed alongside figures like Tomyris, Cleopatra, or Wu Zetian, Hatshepsut embodies yet another form of female power. Where Tomyris wielded the sword, Hatshepsut wielded divine authority and statecraft. Her reign shows that leadership is not monolithic. It can manifest in war, in diplomacy, in trade, and in architecture. She did not need to prove herself by endless conquest. Instead, she proved herself by fostering prosperity, leaving behind monuments that continue to inspire thousands of years later. But her story also reminds us of the fragility of memory. For every Hatshepsut whose tale is recovered, there are countless others still lost to erasure. The deliberate suppression of her name demonstrates how easily women's achievements can be silenced when history is controlled by those who fear them. It also shows why it is essential to seek out these forgotten voices, to recognize their contributions, and to integrate them into the broader narrative of human history. The silence surrounding women in positions of power was never natural. It was enforced. Hatshepsut's life and the destruction of her legacy show us that women did not fail to rule. Rather, the record was made to fail them. To remember her is to resist that silence, to insist that the story of human civilization is incomplete without the women who shaped it. Just as Tomyris turned the tide of battle against one of the most powerful kings of her time, Hatshepsut turned the tide of expectation, claiming the divine mantle of Pharaoh and proving that leadership, prosperity, and greatness were not the sole domain of men. Her temple still stands against the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari, a silent rebuke to those who tried to erase her. The stone walls whisper her defiance across the centuries. They remind us that erasure is never total, that memory can be recovered, and that truth, though buried, has a way of resurfacing. In Hatshepsut, we see not just the triumph of a woman, but the endurance of a story too powerful to remain silenced forever. When we consider Hatshepsut's defiance of expectations and the way she forced her world to acknowledge that a woman could embody divine kingship, the mind naturally drifts forward to later centuries when another woman stood against impossible odds. Hatshepsut's enemies tried to erase her, and yet her temple still rises from the cliffs as testimony to her reign. Centuries later, another queen would rise, not with the divine sanction of Egyptian gods, but with the strength of intellect, ambition, and strategy. Her name was Zenobia, and her defiance shook the foundations of the greatest empire of her age, Rome. Like Tomyris, she dared to confront an imperial juggernaut. Like Hatshepsut, she embodied a vision of leadership that unsettled the established order. Unlike both, her challenge played out on the global stage of late antiquity, where her ambition nearly carved out an Eastern empire that could have rivaled Rome itself. Zenobia ruled from Palmyra, a wealthy city that lay between the Roman and Persian worlds. Palmyra was no ordinary outpost. It was a trading hub, a city that bridged the Mediterranean world with the riches of Persia, India, and China. Caravans passed through Palmyra bearing silks, spices, ivory, and jewels, and in return, the city flourished with wealth and culture. Its position made it both a jewel for Rome and a target for its enemies. By the 3rd century after the birth of Christ, the Roman Empire was in crisis. Civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic turmoil weakened its grip on its eastern provinces. In this environment of chaos and fragility, Palmyra began to rise as a regional power, and at its helm was a woman of extraordinary determination. Zenobia was the wife of Odenathus, the Palmyrene ruler who had served Rome as a client king. After the Persian Empire under Shapur captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle, Odenathus stepped forward to defend Roman interests, defeating the Persians and stabilizing the eastern frontier. He was rewarded with authority and recognition, but his sudden death left Zenobia in a precarious position. With her young son Vabalithus too small to rule, she assumed the regency. At first, this might have seemed like another temporary guardianship, much like the role Hatshepsut had initially been expected to play in Egypt. But Zenobia, like Hatshepsut, was not content to rule as a shadow or a caretaker. She seized the moment, transforming Palmyra from a client state into a sovereign power. Her rule was marked by ambition, intellect, and a keen sense of opportunity. Zenobia expanded Palmyra's control far beyond what her husband had held. She assembled armies and led campaigns that extended her dominion across Syria, Palestine, and into Egypt. Egypt was not just another province. It was the breadbasket of Rome, the land whose grain fed the empire's people. To seize it was to challenge Rome directly at its heart. That Zenobia did so successfully, even if only for a time, reveals the scale of her ambition and the brilliance of her leadership. Her empire, at its height, stretched across much of the Near East, rivaling Rome's own reach. Zenobia was not merely a warrior queen, but an intellectual of high order. Ancient sources praise her education and her command of multiple languages. She was said to have spoken Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and Egyptian, and she surrounded herself with philosophers and scholars. In Palmyra, she fostered a court that was as much a center of culture as it was of politics. Her intelligence was not ornamental, it was strategic. She understood the languages of her subjects, the histories of the lands she claimed, and the symbolic power of presenting herself as both Roman and Eastern, imperial and local. She styled herself as Queen of Kings, aligning with traditions of both Rome and Persia, and invoked descent from Cleopatra to legitimize her rule over Egypt. In this way, she positioned herself not as a usurper, but as the inheritor of long and noble traditions. Her defiance of Rome brought her into inevitable conflict with Aurelian, one of the most capable Roman emperors of the 3rd century. Aurelian, known as the restorer of the world, was determined to reunify the fractured empire. He could not ignore Zenobia's challenge, for her dominion threatened not only Rome's prestige but its survival. The confrontation between Aurelian and Zenobia became one of the defining struggles of the age, a contest not merely of armies but of visions. The campaigns that followed were brutal. Aurelian marched eastward, defeating Zenobia's forces in successive battles. Yet it was not an easy conquest. Zenobia's troops fought fiercely, and she herself was said to have taken part in councils of war, strategizing alongside her generals. Accounts describe her as riding into battle with her soldiers, inspiring loyalty and courage. Even as Rome pressed harder, Zenobia refused to yield easily. She fortified Palmyra and prepared for a prolonged resistance. Eventually, however, the balance of power tipped against her. At the Battle of Emesa, her forces suffered a decisive defeat. Retreating to Palmyra, Zenobia hoped to rally support and perhaps seek aid from the Persian king. She attempted to flee eastward across the Euphrates, but was captured by Aurelian's forces before she could escape. With her capture, the Palmyrene Empire's dream of independence collapsed. Aurelian crushed the rebellion, reasserted Roman control, and punished Palmyra with destruction when it rose again in revolt. Zenobia's fate after her capture remains shrouded in legend and ambiguity. Roman sources claim that she was paraded in Aurelian's triumph in Rome, adorned with golden chains and jewels, a spectacle meant to demonstrate Rome's dominance over even the boldest of queens. Some say she lived out her days in relative comfort, granted an estate in Italy, where she raised her children. Others believe she died soon after her capture, either from illness, despair, or execution. Whatever the truth, the fact that her name endures centuries later testifies to the impact she had on her world. Zenobia's defiance stands as a reminder of both the possibilities and limits of female power in antiquity. She dared to do what few men could even imagine, to challenge Rome itself. Her military campaigns, her intellectual brilliance, and her political vision created an empire that for a brief moment stood as an equal to Rome. Her defeat, however, reveals the overwhelming force of the imperial machine she confronted. Yet to judge her by her end alone is to miss the essence of her achievement. For a time, she redefined what was possible, proving that a woman could not only rule but also command armies, expand empires, and stand toe-to-toe with the greatest power of her age. When we place Zenobia alongside Tomyris and Hatshepsut, we begin to see a lineage of women who disrupted the narrative of male exclusivity in power. Tomyris humiliated Persia's founder, Hatshepsut built Egypt into prosperity as pharaoh, and Zenobia dared to carve out an empire from the heart of Rome's dominion. Each in her own way defied the structures that sought to silence or contain women's authority. And in each case, the attempts to erase or diminish their stories reveal not their weakness, but the threat they posed to the patriarchal order. The story of Zenobia also underscores the deliberate framing of women's power by later historians. Roman chroniclers, while acknowledging her intelligence and courage, often portrayed her as overly ambitious, as though ambition itself were a crime in a woman but a virtue in a man. Aurelian was celebrated as the savior of Rome, while Zenobia was reduced to a cautionary tale of defiance punished. The asymmetry is striking. Her brilliance was undeniable, yet it was narrated in a way that reaffirmed Rome's superiority and male dominance. But the very survival of her legend speaks to a deeper truth. Zenobia captured the imagination of her contemporaries and of later generations precisely because she broke the mold. She was not content to serve as consort or regent. She dreamed of empire, and for a fleeting moment she achieved it. Her name, preserved in chronicles, legends, and later works of art and literature, endures as a symbol of resistance and resilience. When we remember Zenobia, we remember more than the fall of Palmyra. We remember the vision of a woman who saw possibilities beyond the limits imposed on her, who dared to expand her people's horizons, and who refused to accept subordination to a distant power. We remember the intellectual who conversed with philosophers, the ruler who governed with authority, and the general who faced Rome's legions without flinching. We remember that her defeat was not the measure of her worth, but that her very defiance reshaped the history of her age. In the continuum of history, Zenobia takes her place alongside the women who refused silence. Just as Tomyris stood with the blood of Cyrus on her hands, and Hatshepsut carved her name into stone even as others tried to erase it, Zenobia rode at the head of armies that dared to rival Rome. Their stories together remind us that history's silence about women is not evidence of their absence, but of deliberate suppression. And yet, silence cracks, memory endures, and the truth of their power returns to us across the centuries. Zenobia's fall might have restored Rome, but her name continues to echo, carried by the ruins of Palmyra, by the stones of her city's colonnades that still stand under the desert sun. They speak of a woman who dreamed of empire and dared to claim it. Her story, like that of Hatshepsut and Tomyris, defies erasure, a testament to the resilience of women who stood against the greatest powers of their age and demanded to be remembered. When we look back at Zenobia and the way she dared to confront Rome, even knowing the strength of the empire she faced, we are reminded that her courage and ambition were not isolated phenomena, but part of a long lineage of women whose power and presence were systematically pushed aside. Tomyris, who felled Cyrus and reshaped the expansion of Persia; Hatshepsut, who built prosperity in Egypt while redefining kingship itself; and Zenobia, who challenged the might of Rome, all demonstrate that women were not absent from the highest echelons of leadership. They were central figures whose decisions altered the trajectory of nations and empires. And yet, for centuries, their stories were hidden, distorted, or dismissed. The question we must ask is why these stories matter to us today. Why should we recover and tell the stories of women who lived thousands of years ago, ruling lands far removed from our own? The answer lies in how history shapes our understanding of the present. History is not just a record of events. It is a narrative that frames what we believe is possible. If the story of leadership is told as the story of men alone, then leadership itself becomes associated with masculinity, leaving women perpetually cast as outsiders. But if we acknowledge that women like Tomyris, Hatshepsut, and Zenobia stood at the center of world-changing events, then the association between power and gender begins to unravel. Recognizing their power reshapes how we understand the past, but it also reshapes how we view the present. We live in a time when questions of representation and equality are debated in politics, business, and culture. Too often, those who argue against women's leadership claim that history shows men have always been the leaders, the warriors, the visionaries. But that claim is only true because history was written to make it true. When the erasures and distortions are peeled back, when we recover the names and deeds of women rulers, we discover that women have always led, fought, and ruled. The silence was manufactured, and recognizing that changes everything. The modern relevance of these stories is profound. When a young girl learns about Alexander the Great, but not about Tomyris, when she reads about Caesar but not Cleopatra's diplomacy, when she hears of Augustus but not Zenobia, she absorbs the message that leadership is male. By contrast, when she encounters Hatshepsut, who declared herself pharaoh and reigned successfully for decades, she learns that leadership can take many forms, and that her gender does not exclude her from power. Representation in history is not simply about fairness, it is about possibility. What we know of the past frames what we imagine for the future. This is why historical revisionism is not an academic luxury, but an urgent necessity. The act of revisiting history, re-examining sources, and questioning who was left out is a way of reshaping collective consciousness. It requires us to ask whose voices were silenced and why. When we read ancient chronicles written by men who saw female power as unnatural, we must ask what they left unsaid. When we encounter monuments where names were chiseled away, we must ask who tried to erase them and what they feared. This work is not only about uncovering facts, but about dismantling the frameworks of exclusion that have persisted into our own age. The recovery of women's histories also connects with broader movements to recognize marginalized voices across cultures and times. The silencing of women rulers mirrors the silencing of entire peoples colonized or conquered, whose stories were written out by those who dominated them. To seek out Hatshepsut, Tomyris, or Zenobia is to participate in a larger project of giving voice to those whom history tried to bury. It is a practice of justice, a refusal to accept silence as truth. We must also recognize the courage of these women in their own contexts. They were not modern feminists in the sense we understand today, but their actions challenged the gender norms of their time. Hatshepsut adopting the regalia of kingship, Tomyris confronting Cyrus with her own army, Zenobia commanding the Near East in defiance of Rome. All of these were acts that unsettled the world around them. Their defiance speaks to us because it shows that gender has always been contested, that women have always pushed against limits, and that the fight for recognition is not new but ancient. And yet, their stories also remind us of the cost of power. Tomyris lost her son before defeating Cyrus. Hatshepsut's memory was nearly destroyed after her death. Zenobia, despite her brilliance, was paraded in chains to glorify the empire that crushed her. These are not tales of uncomplicated triumph, but of resilience in the face of overwhelming forces. They remind us that the pursuit of power, especially by women, often came with brutal opposition. That they persisted, and that their names survived at all, is testimony to their strength. When we carry their stories into the present, we confront the silences still present in our own narratives. Which leaders today are remembered and celebrated, and which are ignored or misrepresented? Whose voices are amplified, and whose are marginalized? The struggle to recognize women rulers of the past mirrors the struggle to ensure equality and recognition for women in the present. The act of remembering is itself an act of resistance against ongoing forms of exclusion. This is why it is important not only to tell these stories, but to share them widely, to invite others to contribute and expand the conversation. History is never complete. It is always being rewritten as new evidence emerges and as new voices ask new questions. The stories of Hatshepsut, Tomyris, and Zenobia remind us that the work of history is not to preserve a fixed canon, but to continually expand the circle of remembrance. Every forgotten queen recovered, every overlooked ruler brought into the light, makes our understanding of the human story richer and more honest. So as we reflect on these women and their extraordinary lives, let us not treat them as isolated curiosities. Let us treat them as reminders of a broader truth, that history has always been more complex, more diverse, and more inclusive than the narrow versions passed down through official records. Let us see in their defiance an echo for our own time, urging us to look closer, dig deeper, and refuse to accept silence as absence. And as this conversation continues, it should not end with Tomyris, Hatshepsut, or Zenobia. There are countless others whose names wait in the margins of chronicles, in the fragments of inscriptions, in the oral traditions dismissed as folklore. Some are faint, some are half-erased, but all are worth recovering. The act of remembering them is not just about honoring the past, but about shaping the future. Their echoes are with us today. They call on us to see leadership not as the domain of one gender, but as a human capacity. They call on us to recognize that power has always worn many faces, and that to deny half of humanity's contributions is to tell only half of history. They call on us to ask what stories we will choose to carry forward, and which we will allow to fade into silence again. So if you know of other forgotten queens, empresses, or rulers, share their stories. Add their names to this ongoing recovery of history. In doing so, we honor not only the individuals, but the collective truth that women have always been present at the heart of human history, even when others tried to erase them. By continuing this conversation, by expanding our collective knowledge, we ensure that the silence which once buried them will never return.